Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quiet Before, the Culture Panel. This is the last panel in this month's series, the Quiet Before series, and I'm your moderator, Athena Robles. I'm honored to be here with you all watching and with our wonderful panelists. And to set the stage, I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans, also documented as the Nacotchins, and neighbors the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. And so we are here thanks to producer Nancy Bulalakaw and her team who brought everyone together for this series. Thank you so much. To further honor our past, there are organizations that have been doing this work on culture. They've been on the ground advancing Asian American arts and organizations. So shout out to the Asian American Arts Alliance, Asian American Writers Workshop, and the Asian Arts Initiative. All have been hard at work at this for decades. The format this evening is panelists will present their projects, and following the presentations, we will have a group discussion and Q&A. So if you haven't already, please email your questions to quietbefore2021@gmail.com. quietbefore2021@gmail.com. And Quiet Before is, just to kind of give some context and a recap, is a series of panel discussions about violence against Asians in this time and in the history. So the panels were under certain themes, 6 themes: history, the present, the context, the future, the policies, and now in culture. Artists are emissaries of our time. The panelists today have created work out of periods of conflict or uncertainty. Tuesday was the anniversary of George Floyd's death, marking a year of unrest, illness, isolation. May is also the time of the birthdays of Vincent Chin and Yuri Kochiyama, whose birthdays are actually a day apart, the 18th and the 19th. So art is healing, and art is a call to action. Art can help process pain and drive social change. So through all of the panelists' projects, we hope to hear their thoughts on these larger notions of how art and culture facilitate change. So let's do it. First up, we have Herb Tan and Lu Zhang, and their project is Virtual Studio Visit Loop. Virtual Studio Visit Loop. It was an Instagram Live program, and I'm going to have them introduce their project. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Athena, and so great, such an honor to be in conversation with you and all your panelists. I want to thank Nancy Bulalakaw and Caroline Antonio, who I consider, along with Athena, like, sisters of mine. Thank them for making this all happen. So Nancy, could you show the first slide, please? So Lou and I, last year when the pandemic really hit New York, I think we were like everybody else, just kind of shocked at first. And, with both of our jobs, we, didn't have to go into work at a certain point, after mid-March. And for us, it was like, okay, what do we do with ourselves with all this time that we have? And I think one thing we wanted to respond to was just the sense of loneliness and the sense of isolation that I think a lot of, artists are feeling. And even though artists, I think, are used to being alone, I think this was like a really severe moment in which there seemed to not be like a light at the end of the tunnel. And so we decided to do something really simple, just to engage in people, friends of ours, other artists, and check in on them, see how they're doing, see what their communities were like in this time of COVID. And so we created this Instagram Live program that started out with very modest ambitions, called Virtual Studio Visit Loop, and this is the logo we created. It's kind of embarrassing and also like moving to see it on a big screen like this. Next slide, please. And so we started, I think March 30th was the first one that we did with the artist Jamie Chan. And then you see screenshots of 3 other ones here. I wanted to shout out a couple people here, Trisha Baga and her dog Monkey, who they were a big part of what we did with ESV Loop. And essentially it was really like a studio visit that we did with each artist, and we just wanted to understand like what their life was like now, what's different about it, what they're going through now as opposed to pre-COVID. And yeah, again, very humble intentions, but I think for us it really was like meaningful. And next slide, and I'll have Lou kind of chime in here.
So I'll jump in. Hey everyone, I'm Zhang. I'm really honored to be here and just feel really like thankful to be with the great panelists in this series. And also part of the VSB loop, was trying to engage the artist community, and mostly we're friends with. And in terms of the digital device that we do Instagram studio visit with them, and the other side that we found that we are fully engaged with their life, and during the pandemic that we were very separated from each other. So another way to engage is we make paintings for each studio visit. So in terms of making painting, we look through their personal Instagrams and photos from everyday family portraits, and we engage with that. And in that process, Trisha Baga, as our collaborator, also joined. And for example, this painting is the first one. Me and her were struggling with painting the cats on the left, but Trisha kind of jumped in and started picking it up. And next slide, Nancy. So this one was for Edwin, and we kind of developed this way of working together. And I think it was very, like a precious time, because we had a lot of time spent together painting, and we were kind of fighting with each other's desire. And that collaboration during the pandemic period of time really just like taught us, how we could just stay in the intimate relationship with each other and thinking about friends at that time.
Yeah, just to close it off, we did over the course of VSB Loop's life, we did 20 something, I think 25 or 26 of these studio visits. And, it sort of went through these moments in history that Athena was mentioning. So just, really interesting to hear from artists and have, sort of create create community of, folks who were just living through this period and being uncertain about what was next. And, it's cool to kind of reflect on it now. But Athena, we'll pass it on to you if you have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this painting, that last painting, that last slide, that painting and the paintings in general are a really important part of the process of engaging, like as you said, engaging the artists and sort of setting up the whole terms of working with them on this. I think you mentioned the fact that they were friends and people you knew. Everyone was feeling probably very vulnerable, and you asked probably, is it okay to do this? So could you talk about those paintings and the significance of those? And I'm not sure if everyone knows, but those paintings were actually very, very personal to the artists. So maybe you could talk about that process a little bit.
Yeah, so the paintings were really interesting, like conceptually to develop. We did ask, we did tell the artists that we were going to do this, but we didn't tell them what we were going to do, and we essentially just sort of stalked them on Instagram or Facebook or whatever social media, try to look for pictures of people's family and pictures of them in a way that kind of exposed, elements of their character that we knew and sort of wanted to highlight. And eventually, like a lot of the paintings had to do with like people's family members, and it became a kind of important like motif.
Yeah, and sorry, I just want to say, I think you actually said to me, because we're Asian. it ended
Yeah.
up being a lot about the families and parents and
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about that? What is it, like the family element?
I think because like we didn't like we were aiming to think of the community that we were more engaged with. So most of the artists that we visited were Asians or underrepresented communities, and a lot of them have really close relationship with their families. So that's also come from our own experience. Like a lot of my work has to do with family relationships, and so in that way, I think to us, we felt hopeless at that moment, but thinking of to hold on to each other, I think that is like a way for us to stay together without really, being physically together.
and we in just the time we have left, I just want to talk about that moment because it was what some others have described as a burst of life for them for you to do this. And I think we saw that it was repeated by major institutions, museums, big blue chip galleries and artists doing it afterward. And I thought it was interesting when you talked about not doing it anymore since this fulfilled such a big gap and need. Could you talk about why you're not doing it now? Why is it not something that you felt like you should continue in your practice?
I think the title of the piece, why it was We as We Loop, is just because the beginning when we were discussing, I just think because it's a social medium and it's something that we could do. But some friends saw we did the Instagram live and they also started Instagram live visiting their friends. So then their community get, stirred together and it has more access to, broader audience. And I think it was very urgent at the time. And when things started looping bigger, and we felt less of the urgency. And I think in another way that we wanted to stay slower and be more considerate about any further things that we do.
Yeah, I think we're sensitive to not add to the, noise, not add to like the kind of busy, sort of increasingly busy schedules with everybody. And we felt like at a certain moment it was just like right not to, keep it going. But I think
The
I guess,
painting club.
yeah, we still paint, together. And I think the spirit of just being more connected, with people who we know and we love, but then don't connect with too often. I think that spirit is like kind of remaining from the VSB loops.
Thank you. That is a great place to end it, that spirit of connectivity and like we have tonight. So thank you so much, Herb Tam and Lu Song. I'm going to now move to our next panelist. Our next panelist is David Henry Hwang. Hi, David.
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing? Good, thanks.
Good.
And David is a playwright, and he has prepared a small piece to read, which is, we've called this a mashup monologue.
Right. So this is from my most recent show, which was a musical. Actually, we're still working on it, but for a new version, but which is a musical called Soft Power that I wrote with composer Janine Tesori. And, I've come to, in recent months, start to refer to myself as an OG anti-AAPI attack survivor, because I was attacked a few years ago, and in an incident that at the time Assemblyman Ron Kim called a racist attack, but I wasn't personally ready to accept that at that moment. And then I started working on this musical, which I conceived as sort of a reverse King and I, because most of us know the musical The King and I, and when I saw the most recent revival, which was really well done, I thought, wow, there's some problems with this show, like, the premise. It's about a white woman who goes to Siam and teaches the king how to be civilized and how to bring his country into the family of nations. So, it's interesting how a lot of things that we don't necessarily associate with being political actually have a hidden political agenda. And in this case, it's white supremacy. So I wanted to write sort of a reverse King and I, where there would be a Chinese national who would come to America and help what I then thought would be President Hillary Clinton solve the problem of gun violence. Then the 2016 election happened, and I was writing this show. And when at a certain point, I just started writing about my own stabbing. And I thought, this will never make it into the musical. I just, need to do this. But it ended up being a pretty central part of the show. And I'm going to read that section. It's an autobiographical character named DHH. And this monologue happens right after the 2016 election. Am I even going to be able to live in this country anymore? Almost half the population just voted for a guy who thinks we don't really belong here, that we should be nothing more than supporting characters in someone else's story. It's like when I was a kid. This country had been at war with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China was our big enemy. So all the Asians in shows were only ever supporting characters, bad guys, sexy women, or jokes. And they never belonged in America. Whenever I saw a face like mine, I braced myself because I knew something terrible was going on. I hear myself yelling, "What the fuck?" My whole head, it's ringing. What happened? Ow, I slam into a wall. The street is spinning. I hit a parked car. The sidewalk, like waves. Do I have a concussion? I'm bleeding. Stabbed in the neck. What the fuck? No, get to the hospital. Just 2 blocks away. I can't walk. Wait, Boy Scouts, put pressure on a wound. Step, step. I'm walking straight. I can do this. Just 2 blocks away. Don't look back. Just keep going. What's that sound? Blood in my shoes. Cross DeKalb Avenue. Reach in Brooklyn Hospital. I'm gonna faint now. And then, in the moment before I lose consciousness, a whole world passes before my eyes. My attacker had severed my vertebral artery, making me lose about 1/3 of my blood. I should have bled out, or at least suffered a stroke. And my crime remains unsolved. The best police theory is not so different from what happened in my dream, that I was targeted because of my appearance. My assailant mistook me for an Asian delivery person, then ran away when I yelled, "What the fuck?" in unaccented English, and left me to die. All my life, I've been waiting for this to happen. All my life, I've walked down streets where people have assumed I don't belong. All my life, I feared I was marked for something terrible because of this face. And now it's finally happened. And yet, I didn't die. And when the worst thing in the world actually happens, but you somehow survive, you feel, at least for a moment, like you can do anything. So I wrote this show. There's a saying, 大难不死，必有后福. Good fortune will follow. if we somehow survive.
Thank you for that. Wow. It's so powerful, especially to know that it happened to you, that it's real.
Yeah.
It is art and life together. I just, when you were reading it, I wondered, because of all of things that have been happening in the past year, did it trigger anything more for you because your crime is unsolved?
I mean, I think, okay, as I said, I was unwilling to think of it as a hate crime when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then I feel like working on the show made me accept that because, but it was more like I accepted it happened to the character. Like I wasn't quite clear if I was willing to say that it happened to me. And there's this weird feeling of shame that is attached to like being the victim of a hate attack, which is weird and counterintuitive because really, you know, it's the person who commits the crime who should be ashamed, not the victim. But, and I think what has happened over the past year is the hate attacks on Asians have become so ubiquitous. And then particularly after Georgia, when it became clear that, you know, the police never want to call anything a hate crime, then I began to embrace that I had been the victim of a hate attack as well, and come to feel that it's really important for us to claim this. And it's because otherwise we somehow think it had something to do with us, and it doesn't. It has to do with racism in America and white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask you about the soft power part?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe you can give us some significance, because I feel like it's a little bit of a duality there, suggesting it.
You mean the musical soft power,
musical,
or the
the
use of the term? Yeah, so
term.
so soft power is a sociological term that was coined by a Harvard sociologist, and it refers to the cultural or intellectual influence of a country, as opposed to their hard power, which would be their military strength or their economic strength. So soft power is the ability to persuade without having to be necessarily explicit about it, and yet making other countries like you. So King and I, for instance, is an example of soft power. If we think of this as carrying a political message, and yet it's so beautiful, it's so well done, the music's so great, and it just goes straight to your heart without even really thinking about the degree to which there's another agenda there.
That is so, yes. I think that's a common thing in your work, theme in your work, about these, in your different works that are all addressing some moment, this particular moment in either your personal history or in Asian American history, whether it's Yellow Face, which I think is about your father. It kind of came out of something with the background of your father, and Flower Drum Song. So thank you. I think I have to wrap up, and we can go to the next panelist. And the next panelist is Ursula Leung, who is a filmmaker. Hi, Ursula.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And your film you're talking about today is Down a Dark Stairwell. And so we're going to show, are we showing the trailer?
Sure, let's start off with the trailer.
Okay.
That would be great.
Last night was a tragedy.
Akai Gurley was shot and killed by police officer Liang. The charges are manslaughter in the second degree. As a Chinese officer said, they threw him under the bus.
My nephew's life was taken.
100,000 Chinese Americans come out.
What do you want? It is not because he's Asian that we're going after him. We were going after that institution that killed Akai.
That film premiered last month, is that right?
Yeah, it had its public television broadcast on the 12th with the series Independent Lens on PBS. And it's a story about this case that happened in New York City in 2014, where a Chinese American police officer killed an unarmed innocent Black man in the Stairwell of a housing project in Brooklyn. So a lot of folks are familiar with the story, but what I wanted to do was sort of follow the impact and the impact of that incident on the communities that were affected.
This was in 2014.
Yeah,
so it feels like another one, in the last year, but that I think is very surprising sometimes when you hear about that, and it came on the way in the wake of another death of Eric Garner, right, locally, right?
Right.
And the what kind of feedback have you been getting from working with the different communities together?
Well, it's been tough. We released the film during the pandemic. So we had our world premiere at True False, I think on the 8th before, now I can't remember what month that was, but we just a few days before the whole country went into lockdown. So in Missouri, we showed it to a theater of like 1,600 seats, and we're able to interact with folks there. But after that point, we've had to do digital screenings the whole year and leading up to our television broadcast. So a lot of the feedback has been, what I can find online. And that's been a challenge as a creator, making work that you want to, that you really believe is meant to build conversation and not being able to hear that conversation. So it's been a tough way to release the film.
Are you able to talk about the comparisons between this film and your first film, 9 Man? A little bit, the communities, maybe things you've learned from the first one that carried over into the second, in kind of embedding yourself in these different scenarios and situations?
Well, the first film, 9 Man, was about a street ball game they've been playing in Chinatown since the 1930s. And I used it as a vehicle, a season in that sport as a vehicle to just explore like Asian masculinity and exclusion and historical racism against our communities. But that also by and large was like a fun and enjoyable watch and scene to be part of. So they were, in some ways there's a huge contrast in the two films. One is sort of like a celebratory Asian American cultural history moment, and the other is one where the Asian subject in the film is not the hero of the film. So I definitely learned a lot by making that first film. I'm a self-taught filmmaker, and I learned how to make documentaries by picking up a camera and filming that story. And so there were a lot of things I didn't know that I know now. One thing that was really advantageous is that once I had developed years of relationships in the Chinatowns across the US and especially in New York, those relationships really translated into access points for this new documentary. One thing that I found is that that our community in particular is very I guess hesitant to embrace media. And so I think the access to the Asian American community is more difficult than a lot of different communities. And so it helped to have relationships and introductions to help ease my way into this story.
And a big part of that work is representation, whether it's about justice and who's being represented. Are we together in the same purpose of justice? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different communities. Well, I mean, I know you have representation also on your team. I think that was something that was important to you, kind of in front of the camera, behind the camera. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, for Down a Dark Stairwell, this was a FUBU film, a For Us By Us film. I mean, on screen, the only people we interviewed were people of color. I think this was an important access point for the Asian American community to discuss these issues of police accountability. And so I really built the story with that in mind, with the idea in mind that we need to start thinking about these things, to start thinking about coalition building and solidarity and what that means for our community, even when members of our community don't necessarily agree with the other movements that are happening or the other side of the argument. I think it's still essential for us to think about those things when we think about ultimately communities of color being pitted against each other in service of white supremacy and systems of oppression. So yeah, I mean, so I filmed people of color and we made it with people of color. So the teams that we went out into the field with were Black and Asian for the most part. And you know, there's been a lot of, in the documentary community over the pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion about who gets to tell the story. And you know, I was just recently at a discussion at a PBS meeting, and there were station production people who were saying, well, we want to hire people of color, but we don't know where to find them, or they're not as well trained. And it's like, you know, we're all here, we need to do the work, and we need to you know, we need to elevate each other. So you know, there are talented people that are working in film that are Asian American, that are Black, that are not getting the opportunities. And I made sure that that those folks were working on my production, and that part of the production was us having conversations across the divide too.
Right. And even if it's I feel like in the industry, it doesn't matter if it's feature films or documentary. And I think other analysts will speak to this too, in terms of your access or the kind of opportunities that you feel like you're afforded. And it's interesting to think that some people who are very well established directors, or they know they're already, maybe their legacy because their parents or their Hollywood royalty in some way, they get all the opportunities, not just because they're in the room, but they're just because. And I feel like your films and other people and the films that are being created for our communities, they have to work a little bit harder. And I think that there's something about that experience that needs to be shared, because people don't really realize, like, oh, I haven't heard any work from so-and-so in a while. And it's not because they're not making work. It's maybe because they're not getting the funding, or maybe they're not getting the opportunities that other people are getting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I will say that public television is one of the places that really does fund a lot of Asian American stories, much more so than a lot of the other outlets. But you look at somebody like Ken Burns. Ken Burns has had, look at the amount of hours he gets to tell stories on public television. That's with our money, with the people's money. You know, I think he had a series on the American Buffalo, and you know, while I'm sure it was a great series, the Asian American series that just recently aired on PBS, they may have gotten like, you know, 4 or 5 television hours, which may be the same amount that was given to the American Buffalo, but we had to tell our entire community at that time. So, so there are a lot of, you know, I think right now we're at a moment, I think the pandemic has making us take a pause to think about especially the work of independent filmmakers and how essential it is to democracy, and the kind of things that we need to fight for sustainability and for opportunity for all of us, especially those that haven't been heard before.
Right, I mean, that Asian American series, exactly right, is 4 to 5 hours, but when you think about how much work Ken Burns gets, it's like a 12-hour series, maybe weeks at a time, and it allows him also to have this bigger team and support system around him. And that's something that I know in our community, we're really working toward sharing resources and getting together and what we're seeing here, people collaborating and working together more. So I know that, I put this out there to you before about kind of where you are personally in your life, and kind of we were interested in the challenges personally of making work at this time. So I don't know if you want to share some of your challenges or certain barriers that you've overcome.
This is a very roundabout way of asking me if I just had a baby.
Yes, exactly.
Athena knows that I had a baby, and the baby came like 2 weeks before my broadcast. And so, yes. You know, it's one of those things that, you know, my film was done before he came along, but it also create some urgency for some of like the organizing that we're doing in the documentary world, because I cannot do what I've done on my past 2 films in the next film, because I have this baby now to take care of. You know, the films that I made before took several years to make, and mostly, by and large, when we're making indie films, we are putting our own money and our own sweat into something until we get to a point where we can get investors or donors or grantors on board. And it's a really And even when we get those folks on, we're often not compensated for all the work we do. So you may work, 4 or 5 years on a film, which has been sort of my rhythm, and get paid for 2 years at a decent rate. So, there's something about the world that's the ecosystem of independent documentary that's not sustainable for most. And I'm talking about not just like, there are plenty of people who are trying to do the work that are not very good at it and shouldn't necessarily have it as their career, but we're talking about the people who are at the top of the game are still having a tough time making work. And so that's what I'm thinking about next, and how I can actually make the next film. And what's affecting a lot of this is the the new systems of distribution. The world is now watching things on Netflix, and Netflix doesn't support indies in the same way. They only purchase 1 or 2 a year, and those are sort of like their marquee award show kind of films. And there's this whole essential group of other things, especially Asian American stories, that are not getting acquired in those spaces. And so there's a sort of mid-level distribution that's not happening for our community, and it's definitely, I think it makes it much more challenging, especially for our stories, because the things that are getting bought are being bought based on metrics, based on what's happening in Silicon Valley, and in the stuff that happens behind the programming that says that a celebrity profile or a story about a white male is going to get more views. So I think we're as a community of filmmakers are looking at ways to think about more public support for the arts, like they're doing in other countries. In almost every other country, there's so much more public support, because why I don't think we can necessarily argue against the the financial structures of companies like Netflix. We can't argue against our community members who want to watch stuff free on places like Netflix and not pay for the work individually. But we can build like a system that like supports artists more directly and supports projects that are more independent, because otherwise the work is going to be left to people that have trust funds and access points, and oftentimes certain communities are not those folks, and a lot of stories will be lost.
Absolutely. And I have a question for you from the audience. Maybe we can, I don't know, I'm not sure about the time right now, but I think we have time to answer it. Ursula, how has the Chinese American community responded to your film?
Again, I'm challenged to know like all the responses to the pandemic, but I think we've had, number one, we had good response. We did a translated version where we had Chinese subtitles put on one of the streaming versions, and that's the first time PBS has done that, and that got a lot of views. And I think I'm sure there are tons of people who dislike many parts of the film, and there were people who didn't want me to make the film because we have such little representation in media, that putting forth a story that's complicated, where the Asian person's not the hero, is not what a lot of people want to see. So I think that there are folks that still wish that this film didn't exist for that reason. But then there are other folks who understand that this is like a really important topic, and even if you disagree with the film and what people are saying in the film, that this is a vehicle for conversation and to push change. And I think, I mentioned the translated version because I think some of the younger folks find that as a tool, find that to be a good tool to invite, to have some intergenerational conversation, because I think some of the elders or the people who have less English proficiency have less access to this the idea of police accountability. The media that they're reading is not really discussing it. So so I think as a tool, it's going to be really useful, and I hope that's how people are receiving it. And I'm sure there's some people who love it and some people who hate it, but that's what I have to challenge myself to do, is like make work that's making work that's controversial is more important than making work that's well liked. I think keeps people talking.
That's a great point to leave on. Thank you so much, Ursula. So our next panelist is Leung, and Ken is best known as an actor. And the piece he is presenting today is a original written piece.
Thank you, Athena. This is the opening of a piece I've called The Water in May. I did not want to move. I liked walking you to school, your first school. You were still in a stroller. We passed the same man who sat at the same table every morning outside the Parisian-style bistro. He noticed us sometimes. He always had a pastry with his coffee and something to read. Near the drugstore, the pavement buckled, which always took us by surprise. At the Thai restaurant, we would stop in front of the celestial statues every day, even when it rained. Good morning, Buddha, we would say. Then to the three goddesses, good morning, ladies. We found a new home a few blocks from the carousel on the pier. You had your own corner, a windowed space behind the rocking chair that looked out at everything from the street down below to the river straight ahead to the sky high above. You invited me there sometimes. We introduced toys to each other, making up voices for them. Sometimes we counted taxis. New Jersey faced us from across the river. It seems unbelievable now, but it didn't occur to me to check until after we had moved in. Only after we had started to unpack did I wonder what were the chances that we could see it from where we were. I looked on a map and couldn't believe it. The building directly across the river, the most prominent and impossible to miss, which every time we gazed outward, gazed right back at us, was your Uncle Kevin's building in Union City. If we had telescopes, I bet we could see each other. If he was here, if he hadn't left and gone so far away to China, of all places, to find and lose himself, I guess, until the morning your mom and I traveled to the other side of the world to bring him home. It's so poignant to get to read this today. Well, it's very surreal to be here, first of all. I want to start by saying what an honor it is to be in the company of not only this group of artists, but friends. You know, I've just had this unique perspective of seeing this series being created from the beginning. So it's a little surreal to be here. But as far as my brother and this piece, my brother drowned 8 years ago on a trip that he went on for his birthday. And so the day he was born and the day he crossed over is 2 days apart. And yesterday was his birthday, and tomorrow is the anniversary of his passing. So we are right now, right in between. Wow. So it's a very poignant time to get to do this and spend this time with you.
And that piece honors Kevin, right?
I guess, yes, I guess so. I remember when Nancy and I went to Thailand to, you know, we went there to bring his body home. My dad had called me during those few days, and he said, yeah, he was making the funeral arrangements, and he asked me to write an obituary, and I just was not in the frame of mind to do that. So I wrote a very factual obituary, and he didn't use it. And so I think that this kind of serves that purpose. You know, our son Dashel was born 2 years later. And, you know, one of the first things that I thought about when Kevin passed was that, you know, if I have a child one day, that child will have an uncle that they'll never get to meet. And so I have to give him that uncle. And I wrote this. I was shooting a pilot in Vancouver, and I was bored one day. And it just occurred to me that, you know, by the time he's old enough for me to tell him about those few days and about Kevin and etc., who knows what I'll remember from that time? You know, who knows how my memory will morph by that time. And so I just really started to, was like, just get the facts down. And that opened up kind of a portal. That year, I happened to have done a lot of traveling. I was doing a lot of conventions that year. And I went all over the world and spent 2-3 days in Germany and then 2 days in Chicago, and just more than I usually do. And I loved having, I was writing this piece during that time, and I loved having this piece with me. It was like an amulet that I got to take with me, and I felt protected. So I wrote this, once I decided it was for Dash, it was very easy to, I knew my audience. It was very easy to write.
There are a couple of parts to this, and I don't know how much you want to talk about that now, but I know that you had the part where you wanted to talk about Kevin, actually who he was in his life and what happened to him, and then translating that for Dash. And then there's this other part kind of touched on already a little bit, where you say that your book ended around Kevin, literally right now.
Yeah. Weird things started happening as far as, I'm an actor. And just about every single project that I have done since his death 8 years ago now has had something to do with him. Like starting from the very first time I was on a set after his death, after burying him at the cemetery, was a scene that took place in a cemetery, visiting the gravesite of my character's friend's brother. To character, I just weeks ago, I just played a role in a film, where my character's name is Kevin. And this pilot that I mentioned that I shot in Vancouver, part of the story was that a young Asian man was washed up on a shore. And so we had a mannequin that, it was just impossible not to, Kevin was he worked out a lot. He was very fit. The mannequin was fit, short hair, just like Kevin. So just about every single project, maybe one project, I can't find, a touchstone or a touch point. But it could just be because I can't think of one, But so I feel like he's with me. And I think, what I was saying about opening a portal, sometimes when we create from a certain place, and maybe for a certain reason, in this case, for a certain person, our child, not only are you writing, not only are you creating whatever you're creating, but you're opening up a space where things that you would never anticipate or imagine can happen. And, I kind of feel like I've been in that space for almost a decade now. And it's informed my work, I think, in ways that I don't know how to articulate. I'm not alone in it. And like when I come across a project and there's something to do with him, I'm like, aha, this is the next one, so I don't know what that is. I don't even know what I'm saying. It's just that if we allow for a certain space, things can happen,
And I feel like that connects to how you've even come to acting in terms of expression, telling your story, speaking up, representing yourself.
I think it makes me braver. I think because I know it's not just about me. I know I'm not by myself.
Right.
And I think it makes me braver I think I can take chances that maybe I may not have, I can't speak to that, but I feel good about it. Everyone's, they hear I lost my brother, the obvious and rightfully so, reaction is one of sorry, I'm sorry and all this. But I feel really, I feel I have to say I feel close to him in a way that I never did when he was alive. We have 7 years between us. So, when we were kids, we were super close. But as you get older, 7 years between you, you kind of, you can tend to grow apart. And, maybe if he were to still be here, we would find our way back together. But anyway, yeah, I feel close to him in a way that I didn't anticipate.
Do you feel like this would, how it might take shape in the future? Do you feel like this would stay in the form that it is with you now, that you're living with it? It's something
I hope so. I don't know, and I don't want to say, I don't want to call it something. I mean, I am talking about it, so I am calling it things. But I want to give it, it's a living thing. So I want to respond to it. So all I can say is I hope it'll be with me, forever. But as it's a living thing, I'm gonna flow with it, I think it'll morph. I think it'll take, I think it'll come at me through my son. I think it will come at me differently. I always think that when we lose people, suddenly what happens when you cross over is you're suddenly unencumbered by this, by here, by duality. This is me, this is you, we're different. Suddenly you're just one. And so in order to communicate with our loved ones who are still in that place of duality, we have to be very clever. And I think we must try different ways to communicate. Sometimes it's, we spoke about this, sometimes it's, you hear a song and you're like, oh my goodness, what a coincidence, that was the song. But no, it's just a coincidence, and we explain it away. I think there's something to those things, I don't explain those things away. I listen to those things. I look for those things because they happen with such frequency and with such specificity that I can only imagine that, because I'm limited, that Kevin, sometimes it's Kevin, sometimes it's somebody else who's passed, that they're trying. It gives me great it gives me great, I don't know what the word is. I don't think it ends. I don't think it ends.
So the fact that you say it emboldens you and makes you feel brave, I feel like that is so important. We've talked about your work in the past in terms of how you've done your work and kind of what you've seen behind the scenes in your industry, and in terms of obstacles or racism or just general bias.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I feel like that helps you.
yeah, it's funny. I mean, non-Asian writers who write Asian characters, they do so with a creative bias in their DNA that does not come from deceit, does not come from trying to harm somebody. It's unconscious. So I think in line with what we're talking about, I mean, I can't tell you how many scripts I still get today that are indistinguishable from scripts that I've gotten 30 years ago.
Wow.
You know, the same triad bosses who talk in the same exact way, you know. I think as a creator, if, you know, that's fine if you are who you are, you have your innate biases. But if you're going to create for, you know, a community that you're not a part of, it would behoove your creativity to do it in a way that opens a space, like what we're saying. Acknowledge that you don't know stuff, you know, and write from that place, write from the I don't know. Be emboldened by that, you know, like, yeah.
Great, that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much, Ken.
Yeah, thank you.
See you on the flip side.
Okay.
Next panelist is Ying Chen. Ying is hi Ying. Ying is a gallerist, and her gallery is Prey Shadows in Boston.
Hi, Athena. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Yeah, I guess we can start the slide. I have a lot of images, and I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have a couple more things to get to, but I opened the gallery in December of 2020, just about 6 months ago, and it's located in Boston in the Brookline neighborhood. I moved back from New York, and I, like all of us here, I was quarantining with my family, and I had kind of made a decision to leave New York after 20 years, but with only one foot out the door. With COVID, a lot of things changed, but honestly, what changed for me and was the main impetus to do this was the murder of George Floyd. And what ended up happening last summer for me was a lot of organizations and groups and clients were asking me for help in messaging in what to say for Black Lives Matter, and this is coming from cultural spaces. I did that work. My background is in comms and NPR for cultural institutions. But I kept thinking to myself, you know, am I being asked this because I am not Black and I'm also not white? And am I this safe space for people? And it was hard. It was hard in so many ways, but it also led me to start thinking about the kind of spaces that I wanted to show. What do I want to see in the art world? And for a couple of years, I have been running my company as a consultancy, working with artists to help them find projects and revenue streams beyond the traditional art market. So we can advance to the next slide. So I decided to start this company to help people that I cared about in terms of their practice, and see if we can create projects and commissions and partnerships to help artists create revenue streams beyond a traditional gallery system. And yet here I am opening a gallery. But one of the things that I felt passionate about from the beginning was working with artists that needed a little bit more visibility. And clearly that has a lot to do with certain kinds of artists that, you know, we just don't see very much represented in the museum world or in the art market. It can go to the next slide. And so I have been working from the beginning with people that I felt like I could do a good job in helping to raise their voices. This is not exclusive to artists of Asian descent, but it is also very much exclusive to artists that I think want to further that dialogue. So my very first talk, even before the gallery physically opened, was with the Guerrilla Girls, who are the feminist art collective. So we did a talk, and I did the talk with the two co-founders, which was amazing, and that set the tone really for the rest of the programming. You can do the next slide. And the first artist was the artist Jarrett Key, who is an artist based in Providence, Rhode Island, and this was called Chosen Family, which depicted Jarrett's chosen family of queer Black folks. And these are painted on wet cement. oil on cement, and it was a commentary on people who had, the artist would ask people who are not Black, if you close your eyes and imagined a Black person, where do you see them? And a lot of people would respond with, oh, I see Black people on the streets, or on the basketball court, or in prison. And the notion and the concept of cement and concrete was this really powerful medium to try and represent that, because Jared is actually somebody who grew up in rural Alabama and did not have that experience. So this was our very first show. You can go to the next slide. Our next show was a group show that was called See and Be Seen, and it was portraiture, but through a new lens. This is an artist called Suchitra Matai, who's based in Denver, and she was one of the artists that we showed. She does a lot of work talking about the Indian diaspora. But her family is from Guyana. So she's using salvage materials and kind of creating assemblages based on what she finds. I could go to the next. The next show is a show by Duke Riley, who is Boston raised and born artist, but has been in New York for 20 something years. Duke is doing a lot of work with plastic that he finds as trash in the ocean, and using that as also commentary on our environment today. You can go to the next slide. And then you can kind of advance through these, Nancy. This is Yuri Shimojo's pieces from a really beautiful installation called Memento Mori. We opened this on the 10th anniversary of the Japanese earthquake and nuclear disaster. We painted these 10 years ago in response to that. And the show was really a place of healing for visitors, because we also created a special installation, which you'll see in the next slide, that included music and lights, and we did guided meditations around it. You can go to the next slide. This show I just closed last week. It was by Madeline Donahue, who is a Brooklyn-based artist. It's all about motherhood, and especially during quarantine. This was full of humor, but also real, and very humbling as somebody who also took care of 2 small children during quarantine. You can go to the next slide. And we just opened this today. This is Utsi by Nicole Wilson, a very conceptual performance duration-based show. The artist tattooed herself in her own blood based on the oldest tattoos we know of from a mummy called Utsi, who was alive about 5,000 years ago. Next slide. And you can kind of go through these a little bit quickly. This is John Bergerman, who we're showing. Stay here for a second. This is our mentorship program. I feel really strongly about this program. We have 2 high school mentees from the public schools in the Boston area. And the woman in the middle is a curator from a public art organization in Boston called Now and There. And together we're all working on an exhibition that these 2 high school students will be curating at the gallery in August. I really want to see art and visual culture through the lens of a 16 and a 17-year-old. And I am also really proud of the fact that we're paying all of our interns and mentees, and we're giving them opportunities. This came about because I had to take so many unpaid jobs at their age just to work in the art world. So if we're talking about culture and we're talking about Asian American experience, I think a lot of Asian Americans don't go into this field because their parents won't let them take an unpaid job. And there's a lot of privilege in that. And so I want to kind of take that notion down and just create a space where you can have a job, you can learn, and you can definitely go into a field that I think historically has not been open to a lot of people of color. The next slide, please. This is a show we're opening in September. This is a Boston-based artist, Yuan Wu. She did a public art commission in downtown Chinatown, Boston last year, and it's called, it is lanterns that she used based on archives from Chinatown. And so these images are from historic photographs and writing and painting from the community here, a lot of which was completely decimated because of buildings and the kind of rezoning of the area. So she'll be showing here, and she's taking this project to San Francisco as well. Next slide. And this is an artist, James Clark, Filipino-American artist who does a lot of work with light and technology. And the next slide. And this is Yao Xiankuo, who is a Taiwanese-American artist based in St. Louis. Just made it to the cover. I just got this today of New American Paintings. He is incredible. This work is very much about the Asian American identity. Yao Xian had a show at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis about Asian cowboys. And, you know, just looking at, especially as somebody who grew up in the Midwest in this cowboy culture, and how did he as an Asian American man relate to that? That comes off really strongly as a theme in his work. The next slide. And this is an article in Artsy, that's the art site and platform that ran about a week and a half ago, or maybe a week ago. Said 16 rising artists of the Asian diaspora in the United States, and that's Yao Xian's work right there. So I'm really proud of what we're doing. All of the artists for our program this entire fall and winter is comprised of Asian American artists, and it's not something that, you know, I mean, I feel like it's a big deal, but I also don't want it to be a big deal. And I want it to be something where we just, you know, feel proud and feel excited about seeing these artists, but it's not, we don't feel like we're being tokenized for it. You can turn that off, turn the slide off. So, you know, for me, the gallery really came about as a way to bring forth the visual culture of so many strong artists that I believe in, but over the course of many, many years and having been these conversations, there was just this feeling that they weren't being seen and that they weren't being listened to. I would have art advisors tell me, oh yeah, you know, the art market right now for Black artists is huge and it's great, it's gonna keep going. And I would say something about Asian American artists and people would kind of go, eh. So I don't believe that. I don't believe that that has to be the case. And, you know, I think what's been really exciting is showing the voices from the diaspora, but in so many different ways. As you can see from just those last 3 shows, we have painting, we have technology and light, and we have, you know, these very beautiful archival installations. So yeah, this is just the first year and I'm ready. And, you know, we have a 5-year lease on this space, so we'll be here doing this for at least 5 years.
Thank you. That is so great to hear that it's doing well, given the circumstances under which you opened an in-person, can we just take a minute and acknowledge that, an in-person space during a global pandemic, and you're still here, you know, many places shuttered, ones that had support, that they just couldn't do it. And so the fact that, I don't know what that speaks to, your tenacity, your perseverance, your sheer grit.
Honestly, I think I have to say this, a lot of my collectors are people of color. And I think period, that's it. You know, I don't think very many galleries have that. And I think that this is because the collector, they are out there, and we, you know, people who are Asian, Hispanic, whatever. I mean, everyone wants to, if you love art and you have the means, you want to collect, even if it's not very much money right now. So that is something that I'm really proud of. And I think that that's the other factor, that's the other half of it, is you need the collectors who are also interested in taking this dialogue further. And so it's kind of a cycle. It's a big, we all depend on each other to make this happen and to bring all of the community up a little bit further. So yeah, of course there's tenacity and there's luck and there's, you know, I have a great landlord. I have, I'm in a really well-educated community here. So I think people also like to have this dialogue, but you know, in terms of the market and uplifting artists, you have the artists, but without the collectors and the curators who want to take that to the next step, you don't really have that much. So what I'm doing here is trying to cultivate all of it and, you know, making it a system that where we're all kind of speaking with each other and having a good time along with that, you know, and really uplifting one another.
Thank you so much. And we're going to stop there for now. And I'm going to introduce the next panelist. Next panelist is Trisha Lagaso Goldberg. Hi, Trisha.
Hey.
Trisha is an artist, a curator, and working on an exhibition right now. And I'll let you introduce the exhibition.
Yeah, thanks, Athena. I'm Trisha Lagaso Goldberg. Echoing what others have said, it really is an honor to be here. Shout out to Nancy Bulalakau and Athena Robles for their work on this program and the opportunity to share space with, my incredible co-panelists, cultural giants, all of them. I'm currently on unceded Ohlone land, otherwise known as San Francisco. By way of introductions, I have many titles and roles, including daughter of Filipino immigrants, mother to a biracial Black and Filipino and non-binary child, sister, artist, independent curator. I'm here today to represent all of those aspects of myself. And also my role as exhibitions chair and co-curator of the Carlos Villa Worlds in Collision exhibition, which will premiere at the Newark Museum of Art in February 2022 and at the San Francisco Asian Art Museum and at the San Francisco Art Institute in June of 2022. I graduated from SFAI, the San Francisco Art Institute, with my BFA in the 90s. And I felt at the time that studio work really felt quite self-indulgent and isolating and like a solo endeavor. I wanted to connect with others. I really wanted to connect with a community and to be of service to a community, and I really went in search of a mentor. And it wasn't until after I left SFAI that I found Carlos Villa. So Carlos was my mentor, and you often hear in the professional world that it's just business, it's not personal, or you should separate this sort of separation between church and state, between your personal life and your professional life, and that's all fine and good. But my goal in my life is to really bring the two together as closely as possible. So when I found Carlos, he really was the first whole and hyphenated artist that I had ever met. So, he was an artist hyphen educator hyphen curator hyphen activist, etc. If you could go to the first slide. And, thinking about this charge, my charge, from the organizers was to think about what it means to create out of grief or out of a space of conflict and uncertainty, and how art can facilitate change. So I want to start, with a very kind of abridged look at who Carlos Villa was. So Carlos was an important artist, visual artist, educator, curator, public intellectual, activist from the San Francisco Bay Area. He was born in the early 30s and died in 2013. And there are many things to say about Carlos, including that he, was born from parents of the Manong generation, which is, the first wave of Filipino immigrants who were contracted by US corporations to work in fields and factories and on the West Coast and in Hawaii, or the territory of Hawaii. So this is before US statehood in '59. Carlos, came up in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, where he was primarily, in a Latinx and Black neighborhood, very working class. This is at a moment when anti-miscegenation laws and legislation forbidding Filipinos from owning land and establishing businesses were in effect. So this is the San Francisco that Carlos Villa was really, living in. And when Carlos he attended the San Francisco Art Institute as an undergrad. We can go to the next slide. He attended SFAI as an undergrad, and at the time he posed a question to one of his painting teachers named Walt Coleman, and he asked his painting teacher where he could find information on Filipino art and art history, to which Coleman responded, "There is no Filipino art history." And that response really stuck with Carlos. From that point forward, he really went in pursuit, almost single-mindedly, in pursuit of Filipino art and art history, seeking to uncover and create it for himself and for others. On the left is an image of one of Carlos's early works when he was an undergrad at SFAI, and on the right is an example of his work when he did his graduate work at Mills in the early 60s. And next slide. After he graduated from Mills, he followed his cousin Leo Valador to New York, where he lived from, like 63 to 69. And in New York, he was connecting with artists like Bryce Marsden and Saul LeWitt and Frank Stella, Ken Nolan. He showed at the Park Place Gallery, a space that's frequently referred to as the first gallery in Lower Manhattan, which is today Soho. So it really was in New York where he started thinking about being Filipino and what it means, or what it could mean to explore his Filipino identity in his work. And he really felt like those questions had gone unaddressed in his earlier practice. Next slide. So this is like, the kind of Cliff Notes version of the Carlos Villa exhibition, and also kind of an overview of his work. But he returned, after his time in New York, he returned to the Bay Area in '69, and really came back to the Bay Area in a moment of just great kind of civic upheaval and change. This is '69. We're talking about a moment of the Black Panthers were really active. Third World Liberation Front, at San Francisco State University and Cal, that was, students were totally blowing at the scene, around issues of inclusion, multiculturalism in the arts. I mean, Carlos was really thinking about, DEI work, before we even refer to this kind of work as diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide. So we see this kind of repetitive, this coil making that he brought with him from New York and back to the Bay Area, really looking to locate his own Filipino identity within a kind of wider Polynesian oceanic context. Next slide. The next few slides, I just want to breeze through these pretty quickly, but they're really significant in that Carlos was really looking at the Filipino body, his own body, next slide, and really thinking about the artist as shaman. That's one of the things that he was thinking about, the insistence of presence and visibility, kind of resisting erasure, and all of the themes, if you could go on to the next slide, all of the things that Carlos was hitting on then are still relevant today. So I really feel connected, and that these issues are, every bit as relevant and important to me as an Asian American today as they were when Carlos was making the work. Let's move on to the next few slides here. So again, this is, the artist painting with his own body. You can see these sort of orange marks where he's applying paint to his figure, and then applying his body to the canvas to make marks. Keep going. Okay, these are the contemporary artists. I really felt like, in order to tell Carlos's whole story, we really needed to create a space, hold a space for the generations of artists that he has had influence on. Next slide. So this is really like, I think we're missing some slides here, but thank you. Yeah, back one more. So these are just to kind of look at a few contemporary artists that Carlos had, worked with very closely, and who I think were impacted by his way of thinking and his approach to the art world. He was all about decolonizing, every space possible. And these artists were just down to have that discussion and to embrace that as part of their practice. So this is the Mail Order Brides. Their work that I'm including in the exhibition is called Chatsilog, and it's about, communicating across great distances. At the time when this original work in 2010 was created, the artists were spread around the globe, and they collaborated with Carlos. And when they presented at the Asian Art Museum next year, I'm really thinking about Carlos as this collaborative partner posthumously. Next slide. This is very quickly TNT tricycle. TNT stands for Tago Nam Tago, which is the term that in Tagalog to refer to undocumented immigrants. This is a sculpture by Mike Arcega and Paulo Asuncion. It's a mobile social sculpture and karaoke station. Next slide. And then this final work is by Paul Pfeiffer, who's based in New York, but he studied with Carlos at the San Francisco Art Institute. And this is a work that really looks at the Filipino body. So in this case, it's two fighters where the only fighter that you can see is Pacquiao, but his opponent is erased from the footage. So you only see the kind of hits that the Filipino body is sustaining. And each of these artists, I've had interviewed each of them, and they have so much to say about Carlos and the effect that he had on them and their kind of way of thinking, their approach and thinking in the studio, and even the way that they teach their classes. So I think that's it. I just want to wrap that up. I want to leave some time for Athena and I to kind of dialogue. Thanks for the slides.
And can you say the time frame for your show?
Yeah, so Carlos Villa Worlds in Collision opens at the Newark Museum in February 2022. It'll be up for a few months there before returning to the Bay Area and opening at the Asian Art Museum and SFAI in June 2022.
And you're saying he was a mentor, but you knew him also, right? So this is very personal. It's professional, but it's also a very personal project for you. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Carlos was, as I said, I met him at a time when I was really looking for leadership and mentorship in the arts. And it was, predominantly white, and still is in San Francisco and in many different spaces. But Carlos was really it really felt like home. And a lot of artists feel that way about him. It felt like Paul Pfeiffer talks about it in terms of when you enter Carlos's world and you're connected, he thought quite intersectionally. So, I was connected with, African-American artists, with, artists from, like Iranian artists, through queer artists, through Carlos, right? So he was really thinking in those terms 20 years ago when I first met him. And he actually invited me to curate the very first exhibition I ever worked on, which was the San Francisco Babaylan Sister City Sisters exhibition. That opened in the Museo ng Manila in the late 90s. Carlos and I worked on that. It was all Filipino-American artists from the Bay Area, and it returned back to the San Francisco State University Art Gallery. So it returned back home to the Bay Area.
That's great. And I think that we might have to end there, if that's okay. And
yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Trisha. And at this point, we'll bring the group back. And we'll reconvene, we'll reset the stage. Make sure was everybody here. It's great. So, wow, right? Thank you all for sharing your work, your projects. And there is a lot to unpack and think about. There are a lot of common threads between these personal projects that do translate into your professional work and how you address racism, your representation, the systemic racism within the institutions where you work and the industries that you work. And one kind of connection I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't say this is that Ken and David have worked together, and particularly on the piece that David mentioned. So I don't know if one of you or both of you can speak to that.
I would, oh, go ahead.
No, please.
So I would say that the piece that Ken and I worked on was sort of an earlier study for the monologue that ended up in Soft Power that I read. And this was a one-on-one theater experience. And it was the first time I really begun to write about my stabbing, even before I found the work appearing in the musical. And Ken was fantastic enough to want to do this piece and play me in a substantially longer version of my stabbing story. And so thank you, Ken.
It was really remarkable because it was for one audience member at a time. So it took place in a shipping crate. And so every night I did it 5 or 6 or 7 times. And each time it was for one person, which was amazing because I had to really tell it from the beginning, and also I had to react to whoever it was. Some people were really into it. Some people were sitting back, arms crossed, like, give me a show, So it really, I got to kind of explore this experience of David's in just a spectrum of, ways.
Yeah, you even performed it for my daughter.
I know.
Who was with me when
right.
I got, who like accompanied me to the hospital. Yeah.
That was really cool.
Wow. So I feel like that speaks to relationships and relationship building, which is so critical to movement building, because that doesn't happen. I mean, maybe it happens with a hashtag, but it really doesn't last without these interpersonal connections that all of you have talked about that are important in your work. And we have a question for the artists about community building. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. How are you artists engaged in community building? How have you engaged in anti-racist projects?
I'll say something, but I feel like I've already spoken. But I mean, for me, my medium is theater, and I feel like theater is completely about community building. It is about the live experience of performers on stage interacting with people in an audience. And I think about sort of early days at the Asian American Theater Company in San Francisco, and the degree to which that was like a community project. Yes, there were people who went on to professional theater careers, but there were also just people from the community who wanted to try to establish a voice and images and stories of ourselves that hadn't been told before. And in terms of anti-racist projects, I feel like I've certainly been doing a lot of stuff online, but I'm also looking through that to create more solidarity between BIPOC and other marginalized communities, because I feel like this is the way that we can all move forward together. And it recalls the mentioning of third world liberation and the degree to which these communities were united in a progressive goal prior to sort of the 80s and the emergence of the model minority stereotype, which was then used as a wedge to separate us.
The idea of the stories that you were talking about there, and I was just thinking about how there is an obvious understanding among the makers that we need more stories, we have to put them out there. But one thing that was said, that Ursula said, was about work that is controversial versus work that is well-liked. So how do you balance that when you're putting out work that maybe no one has ever seen before and nobody even understands, or they're kind of like, I don't really get this because I can't even pronounce this person's name. So what do you do about that? What have you been doing?
Well, I'll hop in there. I mean, I think this exhibition, the Carlos Villa exhibition, you have to be a good writer, I think, first of all, and you have to be able to talk good about whatever it is that you are, whatever your project is. And I say that because, the Carlos Villa project, while I'm super proud to be a part of it, and I think that the project itself and the exhibition and all of the different participants are like all-star cast and crew, but it's the first Filipino-American major museum retrospective, period, the end. So let that sink in, right? Let's think about that. It's 21st century. And so when we were reaching out to our funders, we really had to make a case, right? And some of them turned us down, and others really saw that this was their opportunity to try to catch up. I mean, they're so behind. The Filipino community has been doing such incredible work in the Bay Area in particular for decades, and Carlos led the way. So I really feel like you really need to be able to be a, like speak from the heart and tell a really powerful story and really be able to communicate that. And I'm just thinking about, being able to communicate, telegraph that to different audiences, the audience that you want to reach, but also funders too, to support the work. And, we wouldn't be able to do a project of this scale if it wasn't for, the Warhol Foundations and the Luce Foundations, et cetera, that really understand how visionary the artist was. And it's my job as a curator to follow artists, to follow their lead. Right. So I need to be able to find the words to describe their brilliance and their visionary leadership, et cetera.
Yeah, I think just going back to that question about how do you build or coalesce a community, I do think, and this is perhaps related in some ways to what Trisha was saying about funders too, but I think money has so much to do with it, for better or for worse. I mean, we're in an environment where, as cultural producers or as artists, we, what we do and what we make can go out there, but in order for it to be seen, you have to have partners and you have to have people who believe in you. And so I guess I'm not an artist, so I'm kind of that person that helps to bring that forward. But I really believe that mentorship and looking at the next generation or future generations of people that are working in this field in culture is so critical. And I'm going back to that mentorship program that I talked about, because when I was an intern, I interned at Sotheby's, and I was like the only daughter that was not of a collector. And I couldn't believe it. I had no idea the world that I was suddenly in. And so I just don't want people to feel alienated, as a lot of people do when they go into this space, because so many people deserve to continue to create, but also if you don't put the money into it, then a lot of this doesn't happen very easily. And I am not wealthy. I have this is not a nonprofit venture, but I am still able to pay my interns. And I just try and stress that to everybody who is trying to kind of create these kinds of spaces. You have to show a commitment to them, and then they'll show a commitment to you, and you kind of carry it forward. But community means so much. It's not just the people around you, it's the people that come after you as well.
Would you say that is a strategy for reaching? So some people say we need to do better within our Asian community in terms of solidarity. And also, as to David's point about other communities, Black, Brown, and Native communities, how do we get that solidarity to show that? And that's something, Ursula, you also spoke about, that we're more in this together than we are different, in terms of trying to be aligned in our purposes. So we can talk about that and wonder what other strategies are we all using that will make us better and stronger and reach together as an Asian community.
Cultural work is an important part of that. What I try to do with my work is draw parallels and really show people we don't have to be the same, but we have to understand that we have some parallel experiences and we have parallel goals. And so all the work that we're doing, I think every panelist here is doing it in a different way, is helping create that, create that work that shows folks what we have in common. And it's a little corny, but it still needs to be done, because so much in this world is driving us in different directions, and both celebrating the uniqueness of our communities, but also sort of underlining differences. So all of the cultural work needs to be done to bring our our goals back in line with one another.
That's great. The as makers, I wanted to touch on something briefly about creative expression and creative freedom and creative control. So sometimes the projects that came out were because it was boredom, or there was an urgency. But how much of the work that you're doing or you plan to do in the future is also out of the sense of wanting and needing creative control and creative power?
This feels like a therapy session, perhaps.
Yeah.
us. I mean, I work in the independent artist space because
Yeah.
I control the things, and I think for a lot of artists trying to figure out how to afford and fund their work is where you start losing control. So I think there's this very specific balance we have to do to figure out how much we can afford to drive our own train and our own ideas, and ideally we're in a place where we all can do that. But it's also important, I think, as much as I personally want to have all the control, I think it's important to be a collaborator. And luckily I work in a discipline that requires so much collaboration that there are always like checks against my power. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a struggle to find the exact right balance.
I also just want to say, I don't think that any of us should assume that as Asian Americans, we all have similar experiences or that we are experiencing the same thing. With Yao Xian painting cowboys and growing up in that region, I mean, I'm from the East Coast, and I think most of us are probably from East or West Coast. There's a really big country here, and there are lots of Asian Americans that are not living these experiences that we have. And that's why, the film Minari was so great, because, you're seeing this representation of Asian American life that is not typical. But I think more of those stories is really needed. I remember in college, I was in the mountains, and this Chinese man had gotten off a bus to go work at the only Chinese restaurant. And he spoke no English. He didn't know where to go. He saw me and he said, "Me?" Me, and he needed to find out where to go so I could tell him. But here was a Chinese man just literally stuck in the middle of nowhere in the mountains in this college town. But again, how much did we know about each other's experiences? Not very much. And so we're not a monolith. And I think that's the other thing we have to really stress is I can't assume that anyone else who is also Asian American is going to agree or have the same kinds of experiences.
Yeah, I want to speak to that also. We have a question, David, for you about asking for some advice for survivors and how to take that step towards creating something.
Yeah, for me, the creative step is the way to begin to heal. And I think, there's a school of psychological thought that suggests that you need to revisit the trauma until you find a way to process it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. But for artists, the way to process it may be through the art. It may not be, but it was for me. So I think as a person, I'm maybe a little compartmentalized, honestly, and I'm not enough in touch with, as I was saying earlier, with accepting being a hate crime survivor. And so the art became a way for me to process that and then come to a more integrated understanding of what had happened to me.
We have another question for another specific panelist, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask it since the audience is out there with wandering minds. Ken, have you read your writing to your son? What does he think?
No, I haven't, because he's 5. I mean, the point of writing it was, I kind of wrote it to his future self. Yeah.
And then we have a question about kind of speaking to the different stories and the variety, how to get the variety of voices and stories out there. How can more Native American and Pacific Islanders get included more in the work that you all do? Herb and Lou?
Wow, that's an important question. And, I think we were just talking about this idea of like community and how to create a sense of one, and kind of starting with those like that are close to us first, which is kind of what we did with the VSV loop, and then sort of expanding the community from there, but from a place of like a common sort of shared language. And I think, we stopped doing the VSV loop, but I think if we were to do it with like more intention in the future, like it would, definitely include like Pacific Islanders and, Native Americans, and other groups. And I don't know, anything to add to that? Yeah.
We have.
Can I just add one other thing there, which is that, I'm from Hawaii, and I actually think about Pacific Islanders and Native folks, Indigenous folks all the time. I mean, I've learned so much, from working with my, Hawaiian, my Kanaka Maoli mentors, friends, teachers, kumu, etc. And to the point where, like, when I came back to the Bay Area after having lived in Hawaii for 13 years, I'm from Hawaii, but I lived there kind of recently and moved back to the Bay Area a couple of years ago. I really saw, the Bay Area with new eyes, and I really look at this place from an Indigenous. I try to, from an Indigenous perspective, and it really has profoundly shifted the way in which I approach all of my work. So I think it's a really important question. Maybe it really is such an important question. And even in the work that we're doing, for the Carlos Villa exhibition, within the Asian Art Museum and San Francisco Art Institute, these are really problematic spaces. No exhibition venue or space is really bloodless, so to speak, and or perfect, but just that consciousness, that like awareness, I think is so important. So how do we bring, I think even asking the question is a place to start. It can't end there.
Yeah, I would add, I'm, I think, substantially the oldest person on this Zoom, and old enough such that when I first started writing about Asian American stories, there weren't that many people doing it. And so the fact that there weren't, you kind of need to have enough confidence in what you're doing to say, my voice is important, and I'm going to start telling these stories. And then, yes, there's a responsibility on the part of the institutions as well. And I also want to acknowledge, even on this call, we don't have South Asian people, I think. So, we need to also try to be as inclusive as possible whenever we can.
That is a great place to end this incredible conversation. We are nearly at time, unless someone wants to share another idea or point. I was going to ask about what people can do to follow in your footsteps, what resources or what qualities should they aim for, or train or strive, but confidence, David, is something we could share and relay to people. Any other thoughts? Okay, we're at time, and thank you so much to everyone and the team and for this Quiet Before cultural panel. Good night.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks, guys.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.